Well, a very warm welcome once again to Moments of Grace, this time episode 16, The World of Harry Potter with Dr. Patricia Ward and the Reverend Dr. Patricia M Lyons. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
Thanks very much.
I think probably the first burning question on everyone's mind is possibly, do you have to have a PhD and be named Patricia to talk about Harry Potter? We're assuming the answer is no, which opens up our audience to a much bigger group of people. But very quickly, just to introduce our two people who are here to talk about Harry Potter with us today. First of all, Trish Ward, Emerita Professor in English at College of Charleston, where she taught for 12 years a course on Harry Potter. She's also our adult ed liaison here at the Cathedral for our vestry. And she is very soon going to be leading our Sunday morning Grace Warts, Harry Potter and the Good News. Trish, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And then we have Tricia with us, who is currently Senior Advisor to the Dean for Evangelism Initiatives at Virginia Theological Seminary. You may also know her as author of What is Evangelism, written for the Episcopal Church. And I was introduced to you, Tricia, by your book, Teaching Faith with Harry Potter, which I read this past year, and which I actually used the chapter on parenting for a previous Moments of Grace. So thank you for being with us as well.
It's fun to be on the broom with you.
Excellent. I'm going to turn it over to Trish.
All right, great. Well, Tricia, I have a big question, and you've probably heard this question before. I've certainly heard it a lot. And that is, how can Harry Potter be a book about faith when God really isn't mentioned?
Oh, that's a good one. I'll begin by mentioning Lord of the Rings, actually. There are a lot of people who are really frustrated with Tolkien's idea of presenting the Christian faith in that series, and God is never mentioned. There's one scene that you could interpret as prayerful, but I mean, literally, there's just nothing religious about it. And Tolkien's idea was that God is a character in the entire story, that none of the bravery and sacrifice and evil and struggle makes any sense at all. So the whole narrative brings God in as a character. And Fleming Rutledge, who's an Anglican priest, feminist theologian, incredible preacher, she has a whole book on Lord of the Rings, and she brings this out in her commentary. So I've always thought, when I first read through the stories, that the same was proving true in Harry Potter. There are a couple of dozen phrases when someone says, "Oh Lord," or "Oh my God," and I circled all of them. But I'm not going to say that's hardcore theology being done there. But I think what you can say about Tolkien, you can say about Rowling's book, which is that God is this unavoidable, irreducible. It's impossible to feel the character of God. I mean, the Harry Potter stories, I would say they are a metabolic story about faith more than they are some sort of catechism that has explicit references to it. I would argue that there are many books that actually have explicit references to Christianity or to God or whatever the deity is of the author that are not half as impactful as writing a story from the first page to the end, that the entire metabolism is sacrifice, the power of blood, the power of love, death leading to resurrection, all the way to those two Bible verses, right, that wind up on Lily and James Potter's grave at the end. So you kind of find out at the end of the book that this entire narrative has been a response to a living God, and specifically a playing out of the deepest Eucharistic, baptismal, and we don't have enough time today to talk about it, but you really can go through, and it's sort of a dogmatic broom ride to survey the core tenets. And not just tenets. Tenets can be like something solid. The living God. The living God, when Harry just, stands at the end in that forest and says, "I'm ready to die."
Yeah.
And then he's surrounded by the communion of saints, that when he says, "Where have you been?" they say, "We never left." I mean, all of a sudden at the end, there's just this blossom you've been waiting for in your garden all season of what this whole thing is about from the beginning. So that's a very long answer to your question. I would not be any happier with this book. In fact, I'd probably be a little frustrated if there were sort of random acts of religious practice, because then you try to figure out, well, what does that mean and how does that relate to magic? Thank goodness J.K. Rowling said, "I'm going to tell a story like a Christian. I'm not going to tell a story speaking as a Christian."
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And I like that you mentioned Tolkien. I think one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking, you also in your book had quoted C.S. Lewis as talking about a way to cast the Christian faith in a way that would be more appealing, less preachy. And I've always thought that the Narnia books were just perfect for that. And in fact, my own experience was that, you know, as a kid, Aslan was a lot more fun than I thought Jesus was in Sunday school. I've, of course, changed my thoughts about that now, but there is something very appealing to not having the preachy, explicit mention of God there. It brings the, you know, the meaning home in a better way, I think.
You know, there's a great essay by, you probably encountered it. First of all, there's that great quotation by C.S. Lewis that says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun is risen. And that not only do I see it, but by it, I see everything else. And Narnia definitely, and also I think J.K. Rowling, who was an Anglican, remember she was raised in a family that was, her parents were sort of 60s hippies, as she says, who were not interested in religion. And she lived right down the street from a church on Church Street. And she was fascinated by it, by the stained glass windows, by the music that would come out of it. And when she was younger, she and her younger sister, Di, would go to the church, and the priest there, the Anglican priest, gave them £1 each on Saturdays to clean the church. And for those of you who are upset about child labor laws, trust me, I have a feeling that this priest was up to something. Her mother had MS, and the father was an erratic personality. I think the neighborhood knew that these were what we now would call at-risk children, at least for happiness. And so they came on Saturdays and would sort of clean up the church and look at the guest book and you know, set up after a wedding or something like that. And Rowling just saw herself, you know, more and more as being a part of this community. And she asked to be baptized herself. Here's the thing, at age 11. And she was baptized at age 11 in that little church in the font with godparents who'd been raised up from the community, with her parents' permission, but not with their excitement. So why do you get your Hogwarts letter at 11? She won't ever say that there's a connection, but at the very least, I love this idea that she believes that her sort of magical identity, I mean, remember the quill writes your name at birth if you're a magical person. So there's something, and we had the same view too. What's happening at baptism is actually the God who knew you in your mother's womb. So it's not that if you get the words wrong in baptism, something is or isn't going to happen. Ultimately, that's not our conviction. That this is a ritual of power and sacrament that makes real to you what is real. So I just think in that Hogwarts letter, when you crack that seal, I think of that we put the seal in baptism on, that you're Christ's own forever. Again, this is just one example, but there's a way in which this whole story pours forth from not just a Christian, but a sacramental Christian who believes in the font and the altar as the ultimate. And those things appear all the time in Harry Potter. Images of font, images of feast, and of altar. In fact, even, you know, the whole Hogwarts Great Hall sort of brings you into that there's the entrance doors, there's the initiation rite of being sorted, and everything leads to the table that is the feast. And yet the table faces out, so everything about the feast sends you out. So I think you could find Eucharist and baptism as a metabolic metronome in almost every chapter.
Okay, well, I'm about to go to the opposite side, because you talked about sort of the images of the font, but there are also perversions of that as well, as when, you know, Voldemort gets his body back, his rebirthing ceremony, as it were. So, which is
quite a sort of in the Catholic Church, they have something called the Black Mass that's forbidden. And it's references to dark magic and things like that throughout history. This idea that there are some rituals that are sort of satanic or evil or dark that are sort of the reversal of the Eucharist. And for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing, go back and read that scene where Pettigrew there's incantations. There's a sacrifice from someone unwilling right? So the father's
Right.
bone was taken unwilling. And then yet there's blood, but blood is shed by a victim, that is not the actual person from whom life is given or will be received. So there's some very dark reversals. I don't know how aware Rowling is. She's never publicly made comments about this, but I definitely believe she's informed by Eucharistic language for sure. Because if you look at the actual elements of that sick and wicked service, at the very least, it is a profoundly coincidental reversal. And of course, you might say, well, that's really wicked. No, it actually helps us know what we do believe. I think the reason she can use this is the definition of what it is to sort of rise from the dead, the evil, is the only sort of, the only ordo that she believes would be most powerful there is actually mirrors the ordo of the Book of Common Prayer.
Yeah, even down to a trinity of objects that go into the
no, it's very dark. That scene is very dark. But it's dark because our light is so bright. I mean, if you get to the end of it, every time I've seen the movie, I'm kind of exhausted. I'm going to confess more than once I've pulled out the Book of Common Prayer and read through a Eucharistic prayer because I have to kind of take a shower from the wickedness of that. And it works almost every time because everything that is conjured there is spoken to in our Eucharistic prayer with hope and light.
And then you do get the communion of saints a little bit later on when Harry's wand engages with Voldemort and you get the whole mesh and all of the priori incantatum, all the people coming back and, urging him on.
Which, by the way, for those of you who just have an epic hobby in terms of movies, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and the last Star Wars movie. I mean, it's almost like as a teacher, I'd have to call it plagiarism if I read all three of these essays in terms of how they ended. I mean, you have Harry in the scene we've just said, standing there where the people tell him that they've never left him and that they will go with him to the end. So you have that. Then you have Lord of the Rings at the very end, right, when Frodo collapses. And this scene is done so beautifully in the movies. He collapses and Galadriel, remember, comes to him in this vision. And she reaches and picks him up, remember? And as she pulls him up, they change the scene and his body stands up. So the figure of the Blessed Mother just coming into history and literally picking up his body. And then the last scene where you have, the female last heir of the Jedi who is in this, lightsaber struggle with the darkest, most evil person. And then he looks at her and says, I am all the Sith. Like, you can't defeat me. I am all evil channeled through my body. That's how this works. You're going down. He calls her a scavenger girl, Palatine. But what did she say? All of a sudden, she reaches out her hand after she gets up off the ground. What did she do? She looked up at the stars and she said, be with me. Be with me. And as she says that, all the voices of all the Jedi who've gone before her come to her, and she stands up and opens her hand, and another lightsaber arrives, and she makes a cross with it and repels, just like Harry repelled the killing curse. And literally, she says to him what? She doesn't say, like, I win, you lose. She says, I am all the Jedi. That's also how this works. None of us fight alone. I know our faith lives are a crowded world full of the communion of saints. If we can listen, if we can hear those voices, and we have the wisdom, the maturity, the authenticity to look up and say, be with me. What does Harry say? Stay with me. I mean, it's literally the same way. Three great epics end the same way, not that the protagonist defeats or kills evil. That doesn't happen in any of those stories. But in all of them, the protagonist finally gives way to ask that those who've gone before would fill them up. And in every case, they don't commit murder. They simply repel murder that insists on itself and it then collapses on itself.
I have nothing to say to that. I totally agree.
Tell me when you read Harry Potter. That's what I want to know. When did your discipleship of the story begin?
I started pretty soon after the books became available in the United States.
Wow. Okay. So you're an early adopter. Nice.
Yeah, I bought the third book, Prisoner of Azkaban, in England when it came out. And so I was reading it before it came out in the United States. I then have to admit that when Order of the Phoenix came out, it was probably several months before I got to reading it. Probably work and teaching and stuff got in the way of that. And I taught my first Harry Potter course after Deathly Hallows came out.
Nice.
In 2009.
Yeah.
And it was funny because a lot of I had 60 people in that class the first time I taught it, which was way too many people. But people had not all read the books. And so I said something about, well, you know, when Dumbledore dies, and somebody goes,
Whoops.
Dumbledore dies?
Did you have grief counselors outside your lecture hall? I mean,
yeah, they needed a little bit of support. But, you know, one of the things that I have in a state school where, you know, I'm not really teaching Harry Potter as theology, I've always emphasized, comes from Tolkien and what he says on fairy stories about eucatastrophe, about that good outcome that in no way invalidates the suffering that occurs, because suffering is happening. But it sanctifies it.
You know, let me just say very quickly, I know we're running short on time. J.K. Rowling does one interview after the Deathly Hallows. She actually did it with MTV, if you want to go look for it. It's a in-print interview. She's asked by the interviewer basically what her motivations were and what did she think about all the religious revolts against her stories, the book burnings in different parts of this country and a few other parts of the world. And she said something remarkable and really hasn't said a lot since. She said that these were Christian stories from the beginning. Yeah. And I could tell the interviewer was even kind of thrown off by that. But here's what she said. And he said, well, why haven't you said anything? For 15 years, you've been seen as the world's most powerful witch. You have people that want to burn your house down, draw and quarter you, literally. And she said, I love this line. This would be an accomplishment for any of us who teach our faith. If someone who'd been in our Bible study or our summer camp or our VBS or our adult forum or our senior citizens Bible study, if a person said what she said, I would just drop the mic. I just say, I'm done. It all worked. What did she say to him? I didn't want people to know I was a Christian. Because if they knew, they would know how these stories would end. I mean, that's someone whose faith has not just become something they look at, like Lewis said. That's someone whose faith has become a way they see the whole world. Doesn't mean they're perfect. And J.K. Rowling has had a rough year or two or three here in terms of hurting other people with parts of her worldview. That is very real. But in that phrase, and then she says to him, you know, there are these two Bible verses, she said, that really capsulize her whole faith. And it is, remember the first one that is from the Gospel of Matthew, that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And she said that last one, that the last enemy to be defeated is death. Yeah. She thought that those two verses, she said, sort of explained what she believed the whole human project is, which is that we do search for truth. We're wired for it. That's Anglican. And as we search for it, we will encounter death and death and death. But what lets us go forward and be a seeker is that we trust that what we encounter in death has been defeated. So I just think that if you want to go check out that interview, there is a time when she actually just comes out and says why it is that these books, remember, last thing, the motto of Hogwarts, it's in Latin, right? Remember? Non titullandus, do not tickle Draco Dormiens,
the sleeping
dragon. Now, that's just not silliness. C.S. Lewis writes a whole essay where he says that when you want to talk about God with a skeptical world and a postmodern world, not his phrase, that's mine, a world that the philosopher Charles Taylor says has been made into a secular world, Lewis said you have to sneak around the sleeping dragon of just the critical, only rational, hyper-rational, tragically rational mind. He said, so sneak around with the truths of God, around that mind by telling a story, making a movie, singing a hymn, that these are all ways to go on the sleeping dragon. And boom, do not tell me J.K. Rowling came up with a motto that says, do not tickle a sleeping dragon. That's her way of saying, share the faith. Don't beat it over people's head. Don't be so explicit that you are actually divisive of people. So her whole story is sneaking around a sleeping dragon. And she told us that in Latin on the crest of Hogwarts.
And that's, you know, what a parable is, right?
Exactly.
Going around.
Those who have ears, that's the grace part of faith, right? It's both a gift and a grace.
Yeah. How we doing, Bryce?
I very much hate to leap in at this point, but as Patricia mentioned, we do, to a certain extent, have a bit of a time limit here on our Moments of Grace. I had one question, but I'm not even going to ask it. I mean, I'm excited. I think I've read through the Harry Potter series 3 times now. You both have given me the excitement to grab it off my shelf and to begin again from the beginning. And I think
that's called a lectionary, right? I mean, just because you do it again and again, it just goes deeper and deeper.
And hopefully anybody who's tuned into this, who's thought, well, why should I read these books? I'm still a bit skeptical of why. I very much think your conversation has probably convinced them, hopefully, to pick them up. But anybody who's already read them, to pick them up again. One question for both of you to answer, you know, maybe within a minute or 30 seconds. And I know this is a tough one to be thrown right at the end. Your favorite scene from the Harry Potter books, and why?
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Trish?
Well, for me, it's King's Cross, Harry and Dumbledore in King's Cross. Absolutely my favorite scene, where Dumbledore tells Harry he's the better man, you know, and Harry comes to this place where he can forgive Dumbledore for feeling that he had been manipulated by Dumbledore. You know, he says something like, how could he hate Dumbledore? How could he be mad at Dumbledore? But that scene, you know, it makes me weep every time. And that reconciliation that they have and that understanding that they have in that scene.
Well, this is why God has put us on the same screen, Dr. Trish, because I also have a scene that is a sacrament. And it is the teaching of the Patronus charm. And every time the Harry Potter Marathon comes on cable, which is, of course, most weekends, when I see that scene, I just stop whatever I'm doing, even if I watch nothing else, to make sure I watch that scene. Because that is where we literally are handed an image of what the Eucharist is about, how to do it, what it means, what its power is. To actually say to Harry, you need a memory so strong that unlike any other spell, this one comes from the power of a memory, right? That's not common. And it took me a long time to figure out why I wept every time I read that. And then I remembered that written on half the altars in the world in all the languages we have is the line, do this in remembrance of me. That it is in telling the story of the greatest act of love and actually saying on the night he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread and gave thanks. That is our Patronus memory. And as we say it, it is not just a memory or a memorial. It fills us. And what comes out of us is the power of the breaking of the bread when it was actually the body of Christ on the cross. And we repel. And remember, Eucharist doesn't end evil in the world or end darkness, but it repels it, just like the Patronus charm. So that's my favorite scene. I love the rest of the books, but as far as I'm concerned, we hit pay dirt in book 3. Where we realize this woman has just told us that the Eucharistic prayer is our Patronus charm. Cast it, and you won't kill a Demeter, but you will find space to breathe and live.
I love that. So just to end on a light note, what would your Patronus be?
Oh, gosh. I'm tempted to say my wife, but that is to put her to service just to my care and healing. And she belongs more to the world than that in baptism. But I would have to say, if it was a small animal, on my Labrador retriever, I have a Labrador named Tignish. Kind of a Narnia-ish, Harry Potter-ish name, but definitely I think a Labrador, because that's kind of who I am a little bit. I'm kind of love the world, you know, wag first, worry later. So I think that would definitely be my Patronus. You?
Well, I have a Norwich Terrier, and I think that a Norwich Terrier would be my Patronus. I'm not the most outgoing person in the world, but I aspire
Contrary to this conversation.
I aspire to be friendly and all of that.
Friendly. Eyewitness friendly.
And my dog loves everybody. So that's my Patronus.
Well, I'm sure I should chime in now and say that my golden retriever, Charlie, wishes he was my Patronus, but I do wish that I was more like my golden retriever. Absolutely. Listen, I can't thank you both enough for coming on to Moments of Grace today, sharing your love and your enthusiasm about Harry Potter. You've definitely made an effect upon me, and hopefully you've made an effect upon everybody who tunes in and listens. Go out, grab your Harry Potters, and if you don't have them, go out and buy them, because I think both of you have unlocked the power and the magic within them for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryce. Thanks,
Thank you.
Tricia.
Thank you.